listen to it and catch up with it later on. We do have a few contributors to the book, either online in the call or joining us in the room. So I'll invite them to come and to give their contributions a little bit later. But so first, let's start with talking about the book itself. So we're here to launch the first great charity of this town, Belfast Charitable Society and its role in the developing city, edited by my colleague Olwen Purdue and published by Irish Academic Press just very recently in the last month or so. For those of you who are here in the room, we have David from No Alibis here with copies for sale as well at a competitive price. So do have a chat with David afterwards if you're interested. And we also have some refreshments as well at the end of the session. So let me talk about the book and why it's worth buying if you haven't bought a copy already, and worth reading. It's an honor and a privilege for me to be launching this book this afternoon on the Belfast Charitable Society and its history. My father was a chaplain in the 1970s of what was then and still today called Clifton House. The building, of course, that was opened by the Belfast Charitable Society in 1774 as the town's first poorhouse. And I have vivid memories of visiting it myself as a child, particularly at Christmas time. Carols may have been sung in those long ago days. The Charitable Society is still going strong, and the book talks about the current activities of the Charitable Society as well as its history. However, when I with possibly a few exceptions in the room, when I ask my students today about where was or where is the old poorhouse, or even when showing them photographs, where is this building, you tend to get blank responses. Few can identify it, despite its central place in the life of the town, for over 200 years now. So the publication of this new history of the Charitable Society is both timely and I think very likely to make its way onto the forefront of reading lists for many of our courses. There have been histories of the Charitable Society before by R.W.M. Strain, who produced a detailed administrative history of the Society in 1960. And again in 2002, when the celebrated Belfast historian Jonathan Barden, sadly no longer with us, marked the 250th anniversary of the first foundation of the Society with a short and readable survey account. However, in more recent years, I think two developments have laid the foundation for the present volume. First of all, there's been a significant surge of interest in the history of welfare, philanthropy, and public health in Ireland, belatedly catching up with the well-developed historiographies and controversies on these topics in Great Britain, the United States, and in much of continental Europe. And the book's editor, Olwen Purdue, has been to the forefront of these developments, initially as a researcher on a project on the regional dimensions of the Irish Poor Law, in which she led on the northern unions, including Belfast, and more recently as the co-principal investigator on the AHRC-funded project on the welfare and public health of Belfast and its region, 1800 to 1973. Olwen's monograph coming out of that project, with contributions from our then postdoc, Dr. Georgina Larragee, on poverty, children and the poor law in industrial Belfast, 1880 to 1918, is due out with Liverpool University Press next year. And that project also funded PhD research on poverty, poor relief and public health in Belfast and its region, 1800 to 51, by Robin Atchison, who's here with us today, who also makes an important contribution from that research to the book that we're launching. And I'll ask Robin to come up and speak about her contribution a little bit later. Separately from that project, the last couple of decades have seen important publications on the impact of the Great Famine on Belfast by Christine Keneally and Jerry McAtasney, on begging and charity in pre-famine Ireland by Kieran McCabe, alongside a renaissance of work on Belfast's urban history, represented here by Ray Gillespie, Jonathan Wright and Ken Dawson. The second major development has been the reorganisation and opening to researchers of the Belfast Charitable Society's extensive and illuminating archives, alongside outreach activities relating to its history coordinated by its archive and heritage coordinator, Aaron McIntyre, and now focused on its recently launched Marianne McCracken Foundation. And this is aligned with the public history initiatives led from QUB by Olwen as director of our Centre for Public History, which also sets the context for the production of the great charity of this time. So as I said, unfortunately, Olwen can't be with us today due to health problems, but we do have a number of the volume's contributors with us, and I'll ask them to outline their chapters in just a minute, but I'll attempt, as I'm the only person who can do it, perhaps to give a brief overview of the multifaceted and indeed beautifully produced volume. There's a short foreword by the former president, Mary McAleese, who herself, of course, a native of North Belfast, and she writes, inspired by the history of the Belfast Charitable Society. And then there follows an introduction and 11 chapters addressing aspects of that history, followed by an afterwards setting out the Charitable Society's continuing work in Belfast today. The chronological focus is principally on the century or so following the initial formation of the Society in 1752, with particular attention to the period 1774 to 1841, when its poorhouse was in full operation and was the main resort for the growing town's poorer inhabitants for aid and sustenance when they fell into penury or ill health. In her introduction, Olwen opens with the continuing relevance of both the ideals and practices of the Charitable Society, as highlighted in the address delivered by the distinguished historian David Olusoga at the launch of the Marianne McCracken Foundation in 2021. Although formerly an organisation to address poverty, from its early years the Charitable Society attracted and embodied the ideas of the radical reformers of the late 18th and early 19th century town, concerned not only with their local poor, but with racial injustice, then most manifest in the institution of slavery. Themes taken up later in the book by Jonathan Wright and by Catherine McWilliams, who writes about the letters of the redoubtable Marianne McCracken herself. The Charitable Society reflected both wider trends in 18th century towns towards civic improvement, undertaken by voluntary bodies, but also the specific aspirations and frustrations of the Belfast middle-class elite in its assertion of autonomy from older and religiously exclusive forms of proprietorial and oligarchical town management. The consequence was an innovative and in its time, remarkably successful philanthropic response that took physical shape in the poorhouse of 1774 and expanded its remit to embrace medical provision, burials, the town's water supply, and vocational education. In many ways, the welfare regime that followed under the Irish Poor Law of 1838 was much more regressive, even if the flexibility and popular support of the Charitable Society allowed it to survive beyond the 1840s with a reduced sphere of responsibility. Although the Charitable Society and its history remains at the heart of the volume, a deliberate decision was made to locate it within the wider social, medical, and indeed political history of Belfast in the period. For the poorhouse was never the sole mode of relief, and those active in the Charitable Society were frequently also involved in other voluntary initiatives around philanthropic provision, as well as the economic life of the industrialising town and a range of political bodies. As Purdue observes, acknowledgement of the progressive and non-sectarian orientation of the society must not preclude investigation of the class-based assumptions of philanthropic work then dominant, especially in a rapidly growing town where economic pressures frequently placed the interests of employers and the urban poor at odds. The ideologies of charity as modes of social control must not be discounted, but neither can philanthropy be crudely reduced to this. The chapters that follow explore these themes with nuance and complexity. So I'll just kind of briefly run through the chapters and then we'll come back to participants who are here with us online or in person. They can say a bit more about theirs. So first of all, Ronnie Weatherup, who has been president of the Society since 2018, sets the scene with a review of the statutory basis, noting that what began as an exclusively voluntary body in 1752 was given legal powers to detain vagabonds and badge the town's beggars under an Act of 1774. This coercive dimension persisted until the 1840s, even if overshadowed by its emphasis on indoor and outdoor relief, funded not by the state, but by subscriptions, collections, and bequests, by income from its burial ground, and under legislation of 1800 and 1817, income from the provision of fresh water to the town. Ken Dawson then traces the complex positioning of the Belfast Charitable Society and its committee members to the political polarizations of the 1780s and 90s, noting the roles of United Irishmen such as Samuel Neilson, Henry Joy McCracken, and William Drennan, alongside moderates such as the Joy brothers and more establishment figures such as the Vicar of Belfast, Mr. Bristow. The crisis of 1798 saw the Poor House temporarily taken over as a barracks and nearly sold off, although membership of committees later allowed some former radicals a means of rehabilitation into the town's life. Jonathan Wright then delivers us a case study in the history of slavery and freedom in 19th century Belfast. I'm going to ask Jonathan to come back and speak more about that in a minute. And indeed then Ray Gillespie, who's also with us on the call, I hope, returns to the origins of the Charitable Society to trace its relationship with the transformation of urban cultures in later 18th century Ireland. And I'll ask Ray to say something on that again in a minute. Aaron McIntyre considers the development of the Charitable Society's innovative outdoor relief scheme, drawing heavily on case studies from the Society's archives and tracing stories of individual experience through these. As a subscriber democracy, the wealthy members of the Society had significant power over determining who were the deserving recipients of relief. But McIntyre argues the poor also had their own agency, evident in snippets remaining in these records. Kieran McCabe then next places the Charitable Society into the wider context of the welfare landscape of pre-famine Belfast, relating this to wider Irish developments. In 1809, a house of industry, in essence a mendicity society, aiming equally to prevent begging and to provide useful employment to the poor, adopted a somewhat more moralistic approach than the earlier Charitable Society model. This and many other smaller societies always struggled in years of agricultural and industrial crisis, of which there were many in the period, and were often underfunded. Nevertheless, there was widespread hostility towards the imposition of a uniform national rate-based welfare system under the Irish Poor Law from 1838. We then have chapters by Lauren Smith, currently a PhD student, or recently currently a PhD student here in Queen's, on child welfare and education. And I hope Lauren will be with us. And then by Robin Atchison, who definitely is with us, on medical relief and public health in Belfast in the period. Robin will talk to us about that in a minute. J.J. O'Neill looks at the new burying ground opened by the Society in 1797 and extended in 1828 and still surviving today, and argues that it's best seen as an example of a new model, non-denominational garden-type graveyard, best exampled elsewhere by the Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, which is opened slightly later in 1804. But there were problems as well with the provision of burials that never brought in huge amounts of income. The last plot was sold off in 1856. And the site was rapidly filled up, especially the ground put aside for the pauper and epidemic burials, both of which were full by the 1840s, but had to be reopened during the Great Famine. And it's that crisis of the Great Famine which is the subject of then a chapter by Christine Kennedy and Jerry McAtasney, revisiting the themes of their 2000 book on the impact of the famine on Belfast. Now, by this time, obviously in the later 1840s, the Charitable Society was no longer in the prime position. Many of its functions had been taken over by the Belfast Workhouse, opened in 1841. But its medical and burial provisions still continued in operation and were put under immense pressure. So this chapter really considers 1847 as I suppose an annus horribilis for Belfast, with thousands dying in the town from hunger and epidemics, particularly typhus fever, and medical provisions overwhelmed, and the new poor law union failing to cope. A crisis only gradually brought under control by the creation of a coordinating board of health in the town with central state support from later 1847. Then the final chapter by Catherine McWilliams surveys the long life of Mary Ann McCracken and principally looks at her activist role within the Charitable Society as a member and later the chair of the Ladies' Committee, set up initially in 1814, lasting for a couple of years, then re-established in the late 1820s and lasting through into the 1850s, which played a particularly pioneering role in supervising the relief made available to women and children, both within the poorhouse and also beyond its walls. And indeed, Mary Ann McCracken, as is well known, also heavily involved in many other campaigns, including anti-slavery. She was a ubiquitous figure in the public life of the town, very much acting in defiance of accepted gender stereotypes. The book then finishes, as I mentioned before, with an epilogue by Paula Reynolds and David Waters, both active members of the Belfast Charitable Society Committee today, looking at its work since the 1990s. It's still, we're arguing it's still at the heart of social provision, especially but not exclusively relating to the elderly, and especially in inner North Belfast. And more recently seeking to revive the spirit of Mary Ann McCracken through its new campaign foundation named in her memory. Okay, well, enough of me kind of summarizing what the book says. I mean, I think it's been a great pleasure for me to read it over the last week. I recommend it very strongly to everybody in the room and joining us online. I'm going to ask several of the contributors now to perhaps say something, and we might kind of go with publication order. So, Jonathan, if you're there, do you want to turn your camera on and join us?
Hi, Peter. Can you?
Hi, Jonathan. Good to see you.
Yeah. Oh, I can see myself on the screen looming over your shoulder rather alarmingly. So, okay.
What I'm going to do, John, I'm just going to stop there. I'm just going to plug in the. I've got some a microphone, or rather, some phones here, which hopefully will help pick up your voice a bit more clearly. So just bear with me. That should work. Okay, try now.
Okay, is that better?
That better? Yeah. Okay.
Yep. Okay, excellent. Well, hello everyone. Thanks, Peter, for asking me to contribute to this. I missed the sort of formal launch at the Charitable Society a couple of weeks back because I was teaching, so it's nice to be involved in this tonight. So, as you mentioned a couple of minutes ago, my chapter in the volume concerned slavery and freedom, and in particular one sort of single case study of this. And when I thought about what I might say tonight, I thought it might be an idea to kind of look back over my old emails and actually see what Olwen asked me to write, and then think about what I did write, think about whether they matched up. So looking back, Olwen contacted me about this back in February 2020, in the before times when we all were hearing news about this thing in China, but weren't particularly concerned about it at that point in time, and asked me if I would do something for this volume. And two things strike me about it. The first is how incredibly accurate Olwen was about her timetable for producing this volume. This was in February 2020, and she was predicting publication in August 2022. And I received my copy, I think, in the first week of September this year. So she got it right on the money in terms of the timetable and production of it. So all kudos to Olwen for her kind of editorial diplomacy and herding us all together at the right time. The other thing is kind of how generous she was in the brief she gave me, or foolhardy might be another way of putting it. She wrote to me and asked me to write, and I quote, something on Belfast's global connections, particularly with reference to slavery. That was it. So make of that what you will. So what I decided to do then was to well, that's not strictly true. Actually, what I was going to say is what I decided to do was to write this chapter on an enslaved man called William John Brown. But actually what I intended to do and what I did in the end are two different things. The chapter that I wrote, or the chapter that appears in the book, was initially meant actually to be a sort of a two-hander. Half of it would be about this enslaved man, William John Brown, and the other half would be about a member of the sort of board of directors, if you like, of the Charitable Society in the 1820s, Robert Tennant. Robert Tennant principally being interesting in this case because in 1830 he emerges publicly as an abolitionist in Belfast, despite the fact that in the 1780s he had been managing sugar plantations in Jamaica. So there's kind of an interesting dynamic going on there. As it happened, however, when I got into the story of William John Brown, it kind of took over the chapter, and I decided simply to focus on him. To kind of summarize the story very, very quickly here, William John Brown is a man who spends about a year and a half in Belfast. He arrives in Belfast in August 1830, when he creeps off a ship called the Planter, which is docked in the town. And he, a few days later, bumps into a member of the ship's crew. And that said crew member is rather surprised to meet William John Brown, because the last time he had seen him was on a quayside in New Orleans, when Brown, who he considered to be an enslaved man, had been employed in loading the ship. Brown was brought before the authorities in Belfast, who investigated his case. He told his story and was given his freedom. His story, to summarize it here, is that Brown was a free black man from Baltimore in Maryland who was kidnapped into slavery round about the mid-1820s. The dates are a little unclear, but he's kidnapped into slavery and he's then trafficked south on what's sometimes referred to as the reverse railroad. So if you have the Underground Railroad, which kind of facilitates enslaved people seeking their freedom, the reverse railroad does the opposite. Brown is trafficked to New Orleans, where he's sold on and put to work. And what happens is he finds himself put to work as a stevedore, loading this ship called the Planter, and he stows himself away in the ship and arrives in Belfast, where he secures his freedom. That's basically all we know about him. The only other thing we know is that he dies in Belfast about a year and a half later, in November 1831, and his body is buried in the Clifton Street burial ground, hence the title of the chapter, From New Orleans to Clifton Street. So what we have with Brown is a man who encounters the Charitable Society through its burial grounds. He encounters it only in his death. So viewed one way, what does this story have to do with the Charitable Society? You could say not very much, I suppose, at first glance, at any rate. But the idea behind this was to use, I suppose, Brown's story, the story of his pursuit of freedom and the way his case is handled in Belfast when he arrives in 1830, as a way of sort of reconstructing something more broadly of the world that the Charitable Society exists in. And what emerges when you do that is really not all that surprising, but yet it's a story that is not yet fully documented, which is you encounter a world which has got multiple connections to the wider Atlantic world of the late 18th and early 19th century, a world which revolves around the institution of slavery. And as a consequence of that, you get on numerous occasions enslaved people arriving in Belfast and having to be dealt with. So Brown is not the first such example. 2 years prior to Brown's arrival, 2 ships had arrived in Belfast from Trinidad via Bermuda, both of which were crewed by enslaved men who were offered their freedom. The majority of the enslaved people on those ships chose to return back to Bermuda rather than embracing their freedom. And there were earlier cases as well, which I discuss in the paper. And what I was trying to do here, I suppose, is shed light on something that has kind of emerged as part of the Belfast Charitable Society story, which is this whole aspect of slavery and abolition. And when this is discussed, it tends to be discussed in terms of the involvement of kind of virtuous and heroic members of the Charitable Society who opposed slavery. So Mary Ann McCracken, most obviously, but also Thomas McCabe as well, who opposes the attempt to establish a slave trading company in 1784. So you can kind of paint, if you like, the story of the Charitable Society's connections with slavery in those positive terms. But of course, we also know that the Charitable Society receives money from people who have profited from slavery, whether directly or indirectly. People like Thomas Gregg, Odell Cunningham, Sam Cunningham, who leave bequests to the Charitable Society in their wills. So there's a kind of a kind of twofold way that you can look at the Charitable Society and its connections with the wider Atlantic world. What I was trying to do with this chapter, though, was to take a slightly different approach by centering an actual enslaved person in this story, and using it to shed some kind of new light, if you like, on the development of abolition in Belfast in the late 1820s, early 1830s. What's significant about William John Brown's case is that Brown secures his freedom through his own actions. That is, he exerts his own agency. He stows himself away. But the other thing that emerges quite intriguingly from it is how his case comes to light in Belfast. Yes, he's encountered by a member of the ship's crew who kind of brings the case to public attention. But whenever he appears before the magistrates in Belfast, it's said in the handful of newspaper reports that we have that Brown is accompanied by what is described as a man of colour who resides in this town, a black man who lives in Belfast, essentially. Now, that's not the first reference we have to this black man. In 1828, when the two ships had arrived from Bermuda, again, we have a reference to this man of colour. And it's said in the accounts of that episode that it's this black man resident in Belfast who A, finds out about the case, and B, takes word of that case to an unnamed Quaker in Belfast, who then takes word of the case to the Moyallen Anti-Slavery Society. And it's whenever members of the Moyallen Society rush to Belfast that the case is investigated. Why is this important? Why is this interesting? There is a narrative that says that anti-slavery is very, very strong in Belfast. I don't see very much evidence for that, I have to say, in the late 1820s. I see evidence that there are a handful of people who oppose slavery in Belfast, but there is no significant institutional movement to oppose slavery until 1830. In fact, until September 1830, when a Belfast auxiliary branch of the Anti-Slavery Society is established, just a couple of weeks after William John Brown's case is brought to public attention. And I suppose what I'm trying to imply here and in the chapter is that we've overlooked the importance of these stories and these individuals and actually bringing slavery and abolition to public light. We know, of course, about Mary Ann McCracken and her kind of passionate opposition to slavery. But the fact remains that there is really no kind of institutional anti-slavery movement in Belfast before 1830. When the movement emerges in Belfast in 1830, it happens just a few weeks after this William John Brown case comes to light. And one of the themes, if you like, that scholars of abolition elsewhere have increasingly focused on is the importance of the agency of enslaved people in spreading and disseminating abolition and in feeding into abolition. That, to put it kind of bluntly, abolition is not simply a story of something nice that kind of well-meaning white middle-class philanthropists did. It's a story that is equally about what the enslaved people did themselves, how they exercised their agency, and how, if you like, that connects with the wider story of abolition. And that's what I think Brown's story is all about. And it invites us, if you like, to look again at the Belfast that the Charitable Society was established in, to think again about those global connections, as I conclude in the chapter, to kind of expand our understanding of Belfast in the early 19th century so that it can include people like William John Brown.
That's great, Jonathan. Thank you so much. I mean, we might take a few questions maybe later on. Let's move over to Ray, who I could see is sitting beside you. And as I mentioned before, Ray's author of a chapter looking at the origins and the place of the Charitable Society within the kind of reformation of urban cultures in Belfast, as indeed in other places in the later 18th century. So, Ray, do you want to summarise your contribution for us?
Okay, thanks very much, Peter. Not wishing to upstage you, but I have a certain claim to my life and career being bound up with the poor in Belfast. I was born in the old workhouse, latterly renamed the Jubilee Maternity Hospital by the time I arrived. And as I grew up to the age of 3, my grandfather was in Clifton House, then almost blind, and I was brought up regularly to see him at the weekends. And of course, you know, my mother and father and my grandfather had things to talk about, which I find deeply boring, and therefore has passed the time running up and down the steps at the front of the poor house, My grandfather shouting at my father, "Stop him, Ernie, he'll kill himself, he'll kill himself." Now, there are many people who wished I had succeeded since that, but nevertheless, I didn't. I have lived to explore the origins of the poorhouse. And the origins of the poorhouse in Belfast, of Clifton House, are indeed strange, because, as Peter mentioned earlier on, the Belfast Charitable Society was founded in 1752, but it isn't until almost 20 years later that they actually managed to build a workhouse. So, why is there a gap between foundation and the attempt to actually do what they say they were going to do? And part of the explanation, I think, is that when it's founded, they really don't know what they want to do. It's founded as part of a scheme to fund a new church, to fund a poorhouse, and to fund a hospital. So the origins of the poorhouse in Belfast really lie in confusion, in trying to sort out in the minds of contemporaries what they think about the idea of poverty, how it should be treated, how it should be dealt with. And so, if we're going to deal with this, we need to begin with the poor. And the poor were a very substantial portion of the population of Belfast in the middle of the 18th century. Exactly how many is debatable. I would guess something like a fifth of the population in Belfast were categorized by contemporaries as poor. That's based on the evidence of names that are noted as poor in the burial register in Belfast. That is from Hindman census of 1757, 8,500 people roughly 1,800 are poor. Just to put that into context, 1,800 people are classified as poor. In the first year of the Charitable Society, 31 people are admitted to the poorhouse, drop in the ocean. So what do they think they're doing in trying to set this up to deal with this absolutely massive problem? Well, I think they don't see it as a problem, because the poor are not regarded in a way as social outcasts or indeed as a problem. They are regarded as part of the natural order, and the hierarchical world is the world in which people thought they would live. And the vicar of Belfast, James Saurin, preaches regularly on the subject of the natural order of the world, of the natural hierarchy of the world, of this thing that he talks about in the 1750s as society, organized in a very particular way. And these people can be taken as being from three classes, really. The poor are taken from either the one end of the spectrum, i.e. children whose parents have fallen into poverty or are been orphaned, or at the other end, the people who are aged and not able to look after themselves. And somewhere in the middle, there are those who move in and out of poverty. So the two ends are the two groups that the poorhouse was meant to deal with. Those who move in and out of poverty are meant to be dealt with in a rather different way. Now, before the poorhouse, of course, what manages the poor problem in Belfast, what manages those who are in structural poverty, that is, those at both ends of the spectrum, are the churches. And indeed, all the churches seem to have had provisions for the poor. But society being ordered by God's providence, it was not the business of the churches to take people out of poverty, because that is where God had ordered them to be. And that it's not insignificant that even when the poorhouse is set up, the first badges that are given say on the badges, the motto is, "He that giveth to the poor lendeth to the Lord." Of course, you would instantly recognize as a slightly shortened version of Proverbs 19:17. It doesn't actually go on to say what the second half of the verse is, which is, "And that God will give things back to them in riches." So this is not a self-interested motivation. So this providentialist mind, if you like, generated within the churches the desire to look after the people who were in what you might describe as structural poverty. It's those in the middle who are the problem. And that problem, it becomes very quickly a problem when crises hit, crises of all sorts. 1740 to 41, blizzards in Belfast, famine, probably worse than the Great Famine proportionately of the population. And these are thought to threaten order. But even more serious problem comes in 1750-51. Same thing. This is the year the poor law, the Belfast Charitable Society is founded. Again, a crisis, an immediate problem that they have to deal with, and they deal with it simply by raising money and handing it out. They have no idea at this stage of thinking of building something. Olwen, the vicar of Belfast, gets up into the pulpit and he tells people, be happy with your lot. But that doesn't work. So there are riots in Belfast in that year, and it becomes even worse in 1756 when there is a second crisis, when Olwen again mounts the pulpit, preached the same sermon that he had 55 years earlier, and look after it. So against this pattern of crises, we begin to get some sort of attempt to maintain local order, and got people thinking about the problem of poverty in Belfast for the first time. And of course, they may start to make inquiries, writing to Glasgow, Manchester, Liverpool, Armagh, about the idea of a workhouse. How might a workhouse work? And of course, in other places in Ireland, Dublin, Cork, they both are toying with the idea of workhouses at this stage. And Belfast is beginning to think about the possibility. Now, is that all it is? Is it just a building to relieve the poor? Well, I think not. There's more to it than this. And that is the clue to the problem is, in fact, the original proposal of the 28th of August 1752, which intended more than a poorhouse. It intended a hospital. It intended a church. Now, why a church? A church and a poorhouse seem unlikely bedfellows. Why should Chichester, the patron of the living, not have paid for a new church? Now, when they're discussing the poorhouse, this is not the only people who are discussing poorhouses. John Black, the Belfast merchant, is talking about making Belfast modern at this stage, and Jonathan has written here about this subject, the modernisation of Belfast from the middle of the 18th century on, which is attempting to turn Belfast into the sort of thing which you're seeing in other English cities, polite centre, a centre where from which civility will emanate. And this, of course, is given impetus in Belfast by the Donegal family, who return after a prolonged period when the fifth Earl suddenly recovers from his madness, and the trustees begin releasing the town. So you begin to get this coinciding with these crises. You begin to get a set of attitudes about what Belfast should look like. And most importantly, how it should look in that way. And the idea, of course, which develops is that the Chichesters had gone for so long, we're going to have to do things for ourselves. The emergence of an attitude of voluntarism in Belfast. Of course, very strong tradition of this. Think about, the volunteers, the Chambers of Commerce, 1783, the United Irishmen, political voluntarism, social voluntarism, a whole range of ways of doing this. This is something which begins to emerge within Belfast. So you're getting if you like, a convergence of a set of ideas: the problem of the poor, the idea of voluntary action, and the idea of reshaping the city in much more modern ways. And these coincide in the building of the poorhouse, because one of the things about the shaping of the city is that Chichester is going to develop a new fashionable quarter. And where is that new fashionable quarter? That is Donegal Street. And of course, if you stand at the bottom of Donegal Street and you look up, there is the poorhouse closing the vista at the end. So this is this is not accidental. This is the creation of part of a new public architecture of Belfast, which contemporaries noted was largely absent. So as the idea of voluntarism, the idea that we are dealing with a society which is beginning to absorb the ideas of the American Revolution in particular, and also the French Revolution, that it's a way that polite culture, that the Belfast middle classes can be seen as demonstrating their idea of polite culture. So it's a convergence of a series of these things which creates an infrastructure which solves a number of problems together. The problem of the poor, the problem of refashioning the city, and the problem of the middle classes being able to demonstrate their newfound position by their involvement in society, by being the independent men of this new world. I can say a great deal more, but buy the book.
Great, thank you very much. It's great to have both of you joining us live from Maynooth. So we have Robin in the room. Robin, do you want to come up and talk about your chapter? Great. Great. Okay. So as I mentioned before, Robin has written on the history of medical provision in pre-famine Belfast. So Robin, over to you.
Well, so my chapter is called Poorhouse to Pandemic. And that's a title that I can thank Olwen for, because originally, like Jonathan said, when Olwen was chatting to me about what my chapter might look like, we had discussed kind of going from the beginning of the poorhouse right through to the eve of the famine, because obviously there was going to be another chapter covering the famine itself. And then as I was doing the research and pulling together things for the chapter, I realized actually this is too much. I won't be able to cover all of this within the limits of the chapter. So I said to Olwen, is it okay if I just go up to the 1832 cholera pandemic and cover it? And that could be like a conclusion to the chapter. And she was like, that's brilliant, Poorhouse to Pandemic, done. And I was like, oh, okay. So that was good. So my chapter really looks at kind of the beginnings of medical relief for the poor in Belfast from the end of the 18th century into the beginning of the 19th century, and the role of the Charitable Society within that. So the Charitable Society, as is noted throughout the book, when the poorhouse opened, it was very important that they also had beds for the sick within the poorhouse. And they initially planned for 6 beds for the sick. And then they soon discovered that that probably wasn't going to be enough. So they had this kind of inpatient service within the poorhouse infirmary. And then they also had an outpatient dispensary type system. So people didn't have to necessarily reside in the poorhouse, but they could come and get help with medical problems. And from looking at the Society archive, which is fascinating, and it was really great to kind of get my hands dirty in there, because it hadn't been available to me during my PhD research. So it was really great to kind of have a look at those files and those records. And a lot of the problems that the infirmary is dealing with in the early years are directly attributable to the poverty that people were living in. So it's a lot of skin complaints, a lot of infections, a lot of things that would be easily treated if you had money, easily avoided if you had money, but just that wasn't possible for the people that were availing of the service. So that kind of humble origin of the poorhouse providing this then kind of evolved into different institutions who were looking after separate groups of the sick poor. But all of these institutions, right up until the opening of the workhouse in 1841, were connected in some way to the Charitable Society. So that's really what I wanted to kind of tease out in the chapter, how these different institutions were concerned with helping the sick poor, doing it in different ways, but each of them had this link to the Charitable Society. So, for example, the line in hospital, which provided maternity care for poor women in childbirth, was entirely run by a committee of ladies, which was very unusual at the time. Most maternity hospitals were started by physicians who had a particular interest in obstetrics, but it was this group of women who wanted to set this up and did so in 1794. And their relationship with the Charitable Society wasn't always the most harmonious. There was a bit of tension between them. They wanted the Charitable Society to help them by, letting them have part of the maternity hospital within the poorhouse, and that wasn't possible. So the Charitable Society actually leased them some land that they could use to build a permanent hospital in 1830. And then there was a lot of tension between them for the rest of the century. pretty much, because the Charitable Society wanted the hospital to be purely charitable in its function. And whenever the ladies kind of bowed to pressure to let medical students attend patients in the line-in hospital, that kind of changed the function of the hospital from being purely charitable to being kind of semi-educational as well. So you have the line-in hospital's connection to the poorhouse. Then you have the lunatic asylum of the town, which wasn't actually a charity, unlike the others. It was funded through taxes, but the Charitable Society had been instrumental in actually pushing for a lunatic asylum for Belfast. They had many examples of people deemed lunatics in their records that had been resident within the poorhouse, and the various ways that they had tried to cope with this section of the population in the poorhouse. And a lot of the people who appear in the records as lunatics recover. So it's more of a minor kind of mental health crisis, we might call it today. But those who were incurable, those who were considered to be violent or dangerous, often had to be separated from the majority of the population and confined either in a cell or in the belfry. And there was use of restraint as well. And the Charitable Society really pushed for some other institution that could better accommodate this group of the sick poor. And that's what ended up happening with the lunatic asylum. So once it was established, there's very little crossover between it and the poorhouse, but the society was really spearheading the charge on getting that. And then the final thing I looked at in the chapter was infectious disease, which was obviously a huge thing for the poor of Belfast, as they were far more susceptible to disease like that than the wealthier, their wealthier neighbours. And the fever hospital in the town was established in the late 18th century, but there was no kind of legislation in place as to who was in control of managing a response to an infectious disease. So when there was an outbreak of typhus, for example, it was kind of left to the various organisations to muddle through it together somehow. And the Fever Hospital and the Charitable Society had a great deal of crossover with who was sitting on the boards, the committees of each. So about 50% of the Fever Hospital Committee also were involved with the Charitable Society. So that led to a lot of cooperation between the two and helped the response to events like that. And then finally, the cholera epidemic of 1832, which was probably the biggest challenge to the public health of the town in the first part of the 19th century. And the Charitable Society did its part in that too. And mostly what they did whenever I was first talking about this chapter with Olwen seemed a very distant, very historical way of dealing with things, but they essentially went into lockdown, which now is much more familiar to all of us. They shut the house down, no one was allowed in, no one was allowed out. They organised for the residents to get their quantities of tobacco and everything that they needed and kind of brought to the gate, but they essentially did what many of us did 2 years ago, and it worked for most of the outbreak. It was a grave digger who actually ended up bringing cholera into the poorhouse through burying bodies in the cemetery. But even in that kind of crisis, the Charitable Society was still working with these other organisations, was working with the Lunatic Asylum, the Line-in Hospital, the Fever Hospital, with smaller charities that were established for the sick poor as well. And it's really incredible that there is this thread. It's not always the most harmonious of relationships within that kind of patchwork, but there is this thread that the Charitable Society was kind of right in the middle of through the whole of the first part of the 19th century until the opening of the workhouse.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Robin.
Thank you.
Yes, you can. Have we got Lauren here?
Yep.
Yeah, Lauren, do you want to come up and speak about your chapter? Yeah, exactly. So you're the last one. So as I mentioned before, Lauren's chapter in the book is about children and education. in the Charitable Society and also related institutions. So over to you.
Yes, so as Peter was saying, my chapter focuses on the children of the poor house. So luckily my research came out of my MA thesis that I did with Olwen. And I was very fortunate as well to work with Clifton House on a 3-month internship with my MA project. So I was able to do quite a lot of research. So what out of my chapter I wanted to reveal was the Charitable Society's attitude towards children and how they sort of wanted to use children as a way to contribute to early industrialisation within Belfast. So my chapter sort of split into 4 parts. So the first part sort of focuses on why the Belfast Charitable Society decided to get involved with child welfare in the first place. Because initially the Charitable Society didn't want any involvement with children. It was only the poor, the diseased, and the elderly. So the first child to be admitted into the poor house was until 1776, when Anne Curran requested her own daughter to be entered into the poor house with her, and this was the first child to be entered, and they considered it to be quite a big privilege in some ways. And then you sort of notice as well, increasingly more single women wanted to bring their children within the poor house, so the society decided, well, allow children to be entered. So then as well, you sort of notice as well, the society was sort of looking at the streets of Belfast, and I think they sort of seen vagrant or children to be sort of like a pest to society. They sort of always wrote as them being vagrant or roaming the streets. So I think they just sort of wanted to help reform Victorian society. So the next section sort of focuses on the education received within the poor house. The society wanted to use education as a way to sort of mould the character of the future working classes. So sort of reforming the moral behaviour was a big aspect of the children's education. Children were sort of always rewarded for behaviour associated with was good behaviour. Sort of if a child was working hard or they done very well in their lessons, they were sort of rewarded. Or my favourite was they were given a dance, which I thought this sounds marvellous. But like say if the children ran off from the poor house, they were late from coming back from church, they were always sort of severely corrected. They were sent to the black hole, which was this sort of confined room, and they could be sent there for maybe 2 days up to a week, just depending on how often they committed the offence, or they were sort of also whipped or flogged. I also look at sort of literacy and religious education as well. So they have sort of these Christian morals, and sort of hopefully they become respectable and upright. Vocational training was also a big thing in the poor house. They sort of gave the children sort of this incentive to be industrious, and I think it also made the children more appealable to their future employers by having sort of these skills available to them. Then the chapter sort of moves on to focus on apprenticeships. So children were typically apprenticed when they were out in the early teens, which is quite unusual because most other institutions like the London Foundling Hospital, they were sort of apprenticed at the age of 10. But sort of through the records, you sort of discovered the society wanted to hold on to them until they were appropriately educated. So just to make sure there was no reason for the employers to want to send their children back. But as well, if there was high numbers of children in the poor house, they sort of had to send them off at an earlier age because they just could not cope with the numbers of them. Children were sort of typically apprenticed to apprenticing to trades that were sort of associated with the working classes, just to keep them within their working class status. They didn't want to elevate them in any way. So girls were typically apprenticed as domestic servants, boys went sort of into manufacturing, and it sort of represented the increasing industrial nature of Belfast. Lastly, I wanted to actually look at was the welfare during apprenticeships, because it sort of shows as well that once the children went off and are apprenticed, the society didn't care about them. They think that's them gone. But no, the society near enough acted as like an intermediary between them. So if there was any problems during the apprenticeship, the children could actually go to the society and go, look, this is not working out, or the master could go, look, this child is behaving like this, the child didn't look like that. And the society could actually solve these problems. And I actually found out, even in my PhD research, apprentices didn't break down because of master-apprentice relationships. It was always usually ill health or the child was just not suited to the apprentice. So that is basically a brief summary of what my chapter is about.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much, Lauren. I'll let you go go and sit down as well. I think we've included all the contributors who are here with us in person or online, but shout out if I've missed anybody who's here. Okay, that's great. I think we might take one or two short questions if there's anyone desperate to ask something. I know it's kind of cold in this room and we've got kind of, potentially some communications issues, but if there is anyone with a burning desire to ask a question, not looking at Sean Connolly in particular. John.
Possibly about the location of the building. When I used to teach this stuff, I used to constantly tell my students, we got this architectural gem to close off the vista at the top of Donegal Street. Then when you walk up Donegal Street, it doesn't. There is a point halfway up Donegal Street where you can see the poorhouse right in front of you. Mm-hmm. When you get to the top, it's actually at an angle. Mm-hmm. It's actually looking down Frederick Street, which is really pretty undistinguished. So is there a reason for that?
I think that might be one for Ray. Ray, did you hear the question there from?
Yes, Sean, there is a reason for it. And that
Ray,
is
mine was dreamt.
Can you still hear me?
Yes, we hear you now. Good.
All right. Okay. Yes, there is a reason for it, and the reason for it is to do with the shape of the site. That when the original site was granted, the plan for the workhouse, and this is part of the whole business of the workhouse evolving quite slowly. The plan for the workhouse hadn't evolved. So when they plunked the workhouse on the site, the intention was that it would be right in the middle of Donegal Street. But unfortunately, it wouldn't fit, and they had to lease 2 more plots of land to the Charitable Society, and this is before the society becomes incorporated. So it's actually leased to 2 individuals on 999-year leases, in order to be able to move the workhouse to a point where it does look as though it's right in the middle of Donegal Street. Although you're quite right, it isn't actually when you get close up to it.
That satisfy you, Sean?
Very much.
Good. Sean is happy with your answer. Thank you, Ray.
Oh, good.
Any other questions anyone is keen to ask? No, it's all gone very quiet. As I said, for those of you who are online, there is wine here in the room, and I think people are keen to kind of move into that phase of the evening. So apologies to those of you in Maynooth and other places who are able to join us there. But thank you very much for being with us and for contributing to Ray and to Jonathan in particular. Also, of course, to Lauren and to Robin, who are here with us in the room. We might wrap up formal proceedings there. Just a reminder that the book is on sale here in the room, thanks to No Alibis, but also for those of you not in the room and don't have a copy already, available from all good bookstores. The first great charity of this town, Belfast Charitable Society, and its role in the developing city, published by Irish Academic Press. So thank you very much for joining us. This is our last event of this semester. We'll have more events beginning in February next year, so you're very welcome to join us for those in due course. Okay, so good afternoon. And for those of you who are here, please come and stay for a bit. Have some refreshment. There's mince pies as well as wine over there.
How are you?